Soldiers at the time in all armies lived a fairly rough and ready life, and by and large they enjoyed that. Their uniforms would have been a long thigh-length coat of wool, with a waistcoat, shirt, breeches, stockings and stout hobnail shoes. The well-known tricorn hat was generally worn, although grenadiers wore the tall mitre cap, which was such a shape which enabled you to throw a grenade without knocking your hat off at the same time. All armies did this. The French armies wore very similar uniforms, different colours. The French soldiers wore a light grey, sometimes called white uniform. Danish soldiers wore grey uniforms. Spanish soldiers or troops in the Spanish Netherlands wore a green uniform. Blue uniforms for the Prussians, red uniforms for the British and the Hanoverians. And so by and large they would all wear the same. Hair was worn long, caught up behind the head in the nape of the neck with a ribbon. And bear in mind that shaving was fairly difficult, there'd be some fairly bristly chins at the same time. It was a very rough and ready existence, but most of these soldiers would have been fairly young men, although there were exceptions, and most would have been drawn from the land. There was no conscription in British troops, but there was certainly conscription amongst German troops and the French levies. These were men taken from their villages, taken from the plough as it were. And so they're used to living outdoors, and they're a fairly rough and ready lot. And then generally there was what was known at the time as a cheerful indifference to physical discomfort. Most battles at the time of Black Powder were very confusing affairs. The weapons at the time, the smoothbore artillery, the muskets, all used black powder. And so great clouds of smoke would build up very quickly, and you get what we know as smoke obscuration. And although the soldier himself would only be able to see a few dozen yards around him, that was all the soldier actually needed to see. The common soldier did not need to see very far beyond the end of the line in which he stood. A soldier who was shot or grievously wounded lying on the battlefield would very often bleed to death before he could receive assistance. And the assistance would come largely in the form of his friends who would look for him once things had settled down and bring him to one of the regimental surgeons. Every regiment of the British Army at the time had a regimental surgeon and a surgeon's mate. Well, bear in mind this is two, when a battalion of troops is 600 or 700, gives you an indication of what the lottery was of surviving. But of course the soldier who has fallen on the battlefield and survived long enough to be taken to the surgeon is probably robust enough to survive. And there are instances of quite severe wounds being inflicted, and the wounded soldier surviving. Amputation of limbs was common. If a limb was shattered by shot, if you didn't amputate it, it would fester. Gangrene would set in, blood poisoning, and the soldier would die. So the simple solution was to cut the limb off. Hence the often seen instances of soldiers lacking arms, lacking a leg, occasionally two legs. But there's also Sergeant William Hine, who at the Battle of Ramillies in 1706 received a musket ball wound to the stomach and suffered a massive double-barrelled prolapse colostomy, which he had for 14 years before he died. Shows what a tough character he was. The campaigning season was really only between about late April to early October for two reasons. Firstly, the roads were unmetalled in the main, and so in bad weather they were just muddy ditches, could hardly be traversed. But secondly, you had the problem of finding enough forage for the horses. It was calculated that an army of 100,000 men strong required 40,000 horses, not just for the cavalry, but also for dragging the supplies around the necessary. And you could only have forage for the horses during the good months of the summer. And there's no point in having an army out on campaign that couldn't move, and without horses you couldn't move. And so once the campaign season in early autumn was over, the troops would go into winter quarters, usually farmed out to the local peasants or in local towns in exchange for money paid to the house owners.